I'm Miles Vexler. Today's press event felt like watching someone trying to mop up a flood with a napkin. Every answer raised more questions, every claim stretched the limits of logic. But instead of despairing, I documented every glorious contradiction and I'm bringing it to you. Subscribe if you are tired and polished nothingness. Passing for leadership together, we will make sense of the mess and have a few cathedral love along the way. As Trump sparks global trade fights, Wall Street panics over soaring debt and bond market instability. The GOP races to pass a budget that slashes healthcare while giving billionaires massive tax breaks. Meanwhile, AI threatens to wipe out millions of jobs, fueling fears of a looming economic and political storm. Trade wars escalate, global tensions spike, and Trump faces legal fights. Tonight's battle over money, power, and politics.
Good evening once again. I am Stephanie Ruhle, and it is day 134 of the second Trump administration. We're starting tonight, you guessed it, with money, power, and politics. The market started the month of June with slight gains across the board. Good news, but that is despite growing tensions between the United States and some of our most important trading partners. Today, China denied the White House accusations that it broke the Geneva trade agreement. Chinese officials said that it was the U.S. was the one to breach the deal and that China was prepared to respond. It is just the latest sign that negotiations between our two countries are going off the rails. Today, the White House press secretary confirmed that Trump and Chinese President Xi will likely talk later this week. And here's what Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent had to say yesterday. Watch.
I'm confident that when President Trump and Party Chairman Xi have a call, that this will be ironed out. But the fact that they are withholding some of the products that they agreed to release during our agreement, maybe it's a glitch in the Chinese system, maybe it's intentional. We'll see after the president speaks with Party Chairman.
Why he's so confident, we do not know. And it is not just China that's unhappy. The European Union is prepared countermeasures after President Trump said he will double tariffs on steel and aluminum to 50% this Wednesday. The EU says this move undermines their efforts to negotiate a solution on their ongoing trade war. All right, with that, let's bring in our lead-off panel tonight. Lou Broadwater is here, Pulitzer Prize-winning White House correspondent for The New York Times. Susan Glasser joins us, staff writer for The New Yorker, and David Drucker, senior writer at The Dispatch. Luke, let's start with you. All that I just went through comes with just about 1 month to go before Trump's self-imposed tariff pause goes away. So put China aside. Where are we on all the potential trade deals with the rest of the countries?
We don't have a lot to show for it. If you'll recall, the White House promised 90 deals in 90 days. I think we have one, the United Kingdom. That is not the type of progress that was promised to the American people. As you just pointed out, China is threatening to retaliate. EU is threatening harsh countermeasures. These look a lot more like trade wars escalating, not like trade deals that are about to be ironed out any minute. Maybe it's true that Trump will get on the phone and a deal will be reached. Sometimes that does happen. But by the White House's own deadline, we are about 89 deals to go and we're running out of time.
And we should note that even the deal with Great Britain was in name. We do not know any details, and what we do know of the deal, we're not gaining more than we already had. Susan, the president is now appealing a second court decision that would block his tariffs, claiming that the ruling is hurting his ongoing trade negotiations. But the trade negotiations are a political argument, and aren't the court decisions based on a legal argument?
Yeah, that's exactly right, Steph. I mean, remember, one of the ways in which Trump has justified this overarching upending, really, of the global trade order is by invoking the presidential emergency powers. As you know, he's invoked everything from an emergency at the southern border to using this on the economy. And it's not going to be resolved let's face it, by the beginning of July, one way or the other. So there's the question you posed at the beginning here, which is about trade deals. Not only are there not 90 in 90 days, it's impossible to really reach anything more than accord to keep talking about an actual trade deal with any of these countries. I think that's important to underscore, even with the deal with Great Britain. That's really what it is an agreement in principle to keep talking about the actual deal. So Trump hasn't even gone that far. But even if he did, this uncertainty is going to hang over the global economy. And that, I think, is what's causing almost levels of panic among many of the business people I talk to, because they can't plan for their businesses. That's not going to go away at the beginning of July, even if Trump were to reach many more of these agreements in principle, because the legal question around whether he can even do these tariffs is not going to be resolved in any definitive way. These are just preliminary court rulings in cases that are probably going to go on for months or years more.
David, I've had one question for about 100 days. With the exception of Donald Trump and Peter Navarro, who are the voters? Who are the leaders that love these tariffs? Because the New York Times reported that leading conservatives pushed a court to block Trump's tariffs. What does that tell us about where the Republican Party really are when it comes to these tariffs? Because for every business leading Republican I talk to, they're sort of holding their nose, holding their ears, holding their breath and dealing with Trump on the tariffs, but none of them are gung-ho behind it.
Yeah, that's correct. And that fits with the business people that I've talked to, business owners who have been impacted horribly by the tariffs, even though they were or are broadly supportive of Trump when it comes to things like tax cuts and deregulation. But the political question you ask is, I think, the important one. And Trump isn't really feeling any political pain from all of the economic uncertainty that these trade wars are causing. Grassroots Republicans are behind him. His approval ratings with them are at about 90% Republican voters broadly, which means when I talk about the grassroots Republican base, they're even happier with the idea of what Trump is doing and happy to give him all sorts of latitude to deliver on this 90-day pause, and I'm sure the next 90-day pause that we'll get after this one expires. And trade deals, which can take several months to years to accomplish, aren't yet completed. Republicans in Congress are also giving him latitude. They're not fighting him. Why? Because their voters trust Trump more than them, and they're focused on the reconciliation package. So Trump can be very sensitive to political pushback, but he's not getting any right now.
Well, I just don't know how this reconciliation package gets paid for. Luke, new topic. We saw Ukraine carry out an unprecedented drone attack inside Russia just ahead of planned negotiations between the two countries. Where do things stand? What does that tell you?
Right. Well, famously, when Zelensky was in the Oval Office, Donald Trump told him he didn't have any cards. He didn't have any cards to play. Well, it does look like Zelensky does have some cards to play, and the Ukraine military does have some things that they can still do to defend themselves and push Russia back. I was talking with one senior Democrat the other day, and he was saying how impressed he'd been with the kind of drone technology and how nimble the Ukrainian military was being with their drones fighting off Russia. So they may have more leverage than previously believed, that they were sort of, counted out. So look, it's a big boost for Ukraine, and I do think it gives them a stronger negotiating position going forward.
All right, their drone technology may be impressive, but what if our enemies use it? Susan, there's a ton of talk since this operation about Ukraine rewriting the rules of war. But what is to stop a terror group from carrying out an attack just like this? Are we prepared?
Well, I think that's the question to ask, Steph. And certainly when I've been speaking with national security professionals over the last couple of years, believe me, they are very, very closely monitoring developments on the battlefield in Ukraine. And that includes both Ukraine's ability to reinvent its economy and actually to create its own military industrial complex, in part because of the uncertainty generated by Donald Trump and the question of how long the rest of the Western European democracies and the United States would be supporting Ukraine. So remember that in part, their ability to iterate has been supported by the previous U.S. administration as a way to hedge against our own political uncertainty. But Russia has also managed to revamp its economy, to remilitarize its economy, to get around, in effect, many of the sanctions that the Biden administration and other European allies put on Russia for its reinvasion of Ukraine in 2022. So you're seeing basically how quickly the military technology is moving. Let's remember that in this attack, a year and a half in the planning, the Ukrainians didn't trust the United States enough to tell them about it, which I think is very revealing in and of itself, first of all. Second of all, this is an attack, not just a drone attack, it's a significant strategic attack on Russia's long-range bombers. These are exactly the planes that are being used to wreak havoc, not against military targets in Ukraine, but Russia is attacking Ukraine's civilian infrastructure and Ukraine's civilian population with these kinds of planes that were hit by Ukraine. Ukraine is hitting military targets in Russia. Russia is hitting civilians.
All right, David, we've got a new topic, the FBI. The New York Times is now reporting that FBI Director Kash Patel is now using polygraphs to control leaks in the agency that are getting to the media, which ironically then got leaked to the media. But more importantly, senior leaders are being pushed out around this. What does the loss of experience, these experienced members of the FBI, what does it mean for the safety of the American people that they're getting pushed out following this polygraph bonanza?
Right. Well, these are the kind of questions that get asked if an attack gets by our national security agencies and something happens, right? And so, there are some veterans of the FBI that are supportive of what they believe is a long overdue overhaul that Patel is pushing through. Others have obviously been critical. I think this is the sort of thing that the American people are not going to pay too much attention to on a daily basis. It doesn't mean it doesn't matter. I think the big question is, how does Kash Patel handle the intelligence unit in the FBI, the one that is responsible for monitoring potential terrorist attacks and stopping them before they happen? Again, these sorts of questions get asked after something happens. But if his overhaul proceeds and there's no major domestic incident that the FBI was supposed to be on top of, I don't suspect you're going to hear many complaints, although it is the sort of thing that years after this administration has left office, things could happen when you look for the seeds of what precipitated it. The loss of experienced staff and personnel is the sort of thing people would point to.
Susan, I want to go back to something David was saying earlier, how Donald Trump feels very little political pressure. Jonathan V. Last wrote something for The Bulwark where he said that while Trump might be losing on policy and in the courts, he is succeeding big time in accumulating more actual power, especially with the way he's using federal law enforcement. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it's a really important point, and I tend to agree. I'm amazed that Trump has launched attacks on so many fronts, and Democrats continue to be sort of so self-absorbed and almost supine in terms of finding a way to actually fight back against this. But
Susan, it doesn't have to be what are Democrats doing. It's why are so many Republicans, why are so many Americans seeing what Trump is doing and they're okay with it?
Well, I don't think that's a but. I think it's both stuff, unfortunately. What we're dealing with is a reality of Republican Party that's long since been completely taken over and subsumed and become the Trump Republican Party. So I think that's part of Trump's advantage right now, is that people aren't even pretending that there's going to be any meaningful pushback from Republicans. So that's number one, is that it's almost taken as a given. Whereas 8 years ago in the first Trump term, right, every outrageous new step was followed by a whole genuine news cycle about whether there was going to be any Republicans to step forward and challenge it, whether inside the administration or on Capitol Hill. This time, none of that is actually happening. So that's number one. Trump pockets the gains of having a Republican Party that's basically gone completely dark, that is only the Trump Republican Party. But I think this weaponization of law enforcement that you're pointing out, it is chilling. It is probably the optics that Donald Trump and Stephen Miller that they crave, are these shock videos that we're now seeing with incredible regularity on social media, the horror stories of the young teenager who's lived in America's whole life, who's on the way to the volleyball practice in Massachusetts and is snatched, the people who go into court and instead of having a court hearing on their asylum application, they're grabbed and thrown into jail. I mean, it's this kind of horror stories, the visuals that ICE is releasing of their raids on people. I think that whereas a part of the country looks on it with horror, this is exactly what Trump's part of America, many of them, millions of people were craving this. These are the people who were chanting and applauding and clapping last summer in Milwaukee, mass deportation now. And so I feel like this is them following through on what Trump thinks that he got elected on.
All right, before we go, I do want to cover one more topic. Luke, today the man that was accused of attacking a Colorado group that was calling for the release of Israeli hostages, he was charged with attempted murder in state court as well as the federal hate crime. What has the reaction been like in D.C.?
Well, it's been tremendous outrage, and it's been bipartisan. Both sides of the aisle have condemned this attack and the rising level of anti-Semitism we're seeing in America, and it's the latest in a string of events. So it's, there doesn't seem to be any detractor on this issue. Everyone can agree this terrible attack has to be condemned.
All right, Luke, thank you so much. Susan, David, thank you as well. Thank you for all starting us off tonight.
As Trump's second term unfolds, trade disputes with China and Europe intensify, courts challenge his tariffs, and Republicans waver under economic strain. Meanwhile, Ukraine's drone attacks reshape war tactics, the FBI faces internal purges, and Trump's law enforcement weaponization sparks alarm, all as bipartisan outrage grows over rising hate crimes. Debt skyrockets, tariffs rise, and Wall Street braces for impact. Trump's risky economic gamble rattles global markets.
All right, we are still talking money, power, politics. While investors scramble around the uncertainty of tariffs, JP Morgan's CEO says their biggest concern might not be trade at all. Not that trade is okay, but it's not his number one issue. The U.S. debt is. Watch this.
If people decide that the U.S. dollar isn't the place to be, yeah, you could see, spreads gap out, credit spreads gap out, and that would become a problem. It hurts the people raising money, and that includes small businesses. That includes loans to small businesses, includes high yield debt, it includes leveraged lending, includes real estate loans. That's why you should worry about volatility in the bond market.
Okay, so I want to take a second to explain something. The bond market. And before you let your eyes glaze over and say, Stephanie, it is 11:20 at night, I don't want to hear about bonds, just bear with me. Because if there is any guardrail that might convince President Trump to back off some of his more extreme economic policies, it is the almighty bond market. So I think it makes sense to give it a bit more attention tonight. When you hear about bonds, we are talking about U.S. Treasuries, which are widely considered the safest, highest quality place to put your money, which is why countries and investors around the world are so heavily invested in them. And how do they work? Okay, so a bond, it's like a loan where the borrower pays back with interest. That is the yield. And if the lender thinks the borrower is high risk, well, then they demand a higher interest rate. But the U.S. is seen as so safe that the interest rates, those yields, are normally very low. Well, last month, when the House passed a budget bill that could add $3.8 trillion to our debt, guess what bond yields did? They went up. That is the market telling us it is worried that the U.S. is borrowing so much, in large part to pay for tax cuts. And Trump knows how important the bond market is. He acknowledged it back in April when he paused the tariffs. Rising bond yields were one of the main reasons he pressed that 90-day pause. And now investors around the world might not be feeling like the safest asset in the world, bonds, are so safe anymore. And if right now you are saying, why in the world do I care? Treasury bonds mean nothing to me. Well, higher interest rates for treasuries, especially the 10-year, well, that means you're going to pay more for a mortgage, a car loan, or a business loan. And your credit card debt just got more expensive. So when and if global investors really do potentially lose faith in U.S. treasuries and the bond market actually cracks, well, then I will be sitting here in this seat with no good news to report. For more, I want to bring in Liz Hoffman, business and finance editor for Semaphore, and my old friend Bharat Ramamurthy, former National Economic Council deputy director in the Biden White House. Liz, how long can President Trump basically stress test the bond market before those investors say, mercy, I'm out?
The real question when you talk about is the dollar going to lose its reserve status, is the U.S. Treasury bond not going to be what it used to be, where are they going to go, right? And I think right now the issue is that there isn't really a compelling alternative, so they freak out and then they come back. And, you know, you're right that was ultimately, there was this talk about this Trump put, right? If the market's going to go down so much that he's going to have to buy back everything he's put out there. People had sort of assumed it was in the stock market and it was like down 5%. And it turns out it was in the bond market. And it was a really, really scary day. You know, you talk to people who've been on Wall Street a long time and they say the last time I was that scared was 2008.
Correct.
So look, these things get tested. But, you know, the administration, they push and then they pull back when they feel like they had to. But, you know, Scott Bessent, after the Treasury Secretary, after Moody's downgraded the U.S. debt, he said, who cares?
Which is amazing because when Scott Bessent took the job, he said his number one focus was the fiscal cliff. He was panicked over debt and deficits. He thought Joe Biden was public enemy number one for ballooning our deficit. And here we are with Trump's big, beautiful bill, potentially adding $3.8 trillion. Bharat, what's your take?
Well, it's the same old story. You know, during Trump's first term, in just 4 years, they added $8 trillion to the debt. That was a quarter of the debt that the United States has accumulated in its entire history. And the thing that is most galling about this, from my perspective, is that what are we doing this for? We're not in the middle of a financial crisis where we need to bail out the economy. We're not in the middle of COVID where we need to borrow $4 trillion to make sure that the economy doesn't fall off a cliff. There's a 4.2% unemployment rate. Inflation is coming down towards the target. There's no basis, there's no reason for doing all of this. And in fact, the bill that you're talking about not only adds $4 trillion in debt, it kicks 13 million people off of their health insurance. It repeals clean energy tax credits, which will make America less energy independent. It doesn't cause any economic growth, according to a wide variety of analysts, including right-leaning analysts. So what is this all for? All this debt, all this risk we're adding to the economy, it's mostly to give tax cuts to the very wealthy. In fact, the top 0.1%, the top 0.1% get an average annual tax cut of $450,000. So when people are wondering where did their money go and why are we getting all this debt, that's where it went.
What is your take, Bharat, on what Jamie Dimon laid out? And I want to remind our audience, I'm sure it's one of the reasons Jamie Dimon was on Fox Business, of all places. Donald Trump listens to Jamie Dimon. Whether or not he likes him is irrelevant. He knows how influential he is. And Jamie Dimon laid out today what an unstable bond market does to small businesses, big businesses, everyday Americans.
Yeah, you know, this is maybe a rare instance where I agree with Jamie Dimon, where I think that it is the baseline rate for basically everything in the economy. And so when that rate starts to go up, as he said, small business loans go up, credit card rates go up, mortgages go up. You know, I think when Donald Trump was running for president, a big push that he made and a big promise he made to the American people was, I'm going to bring down the cost of housing by bringing mortgage rates down. Well, here we are, and the rates have actually gone up since he won his election. And there's no real pathway forward for those rates to come down. And that's basically freezing the entire mortgage market because people are unwilling to sell their home and get out of a 3% mortgage in order to buy a new home at a 7% mortgage. So it's had a cascading effect throughout the economy. I think a wise course of action now would be aggressive debt reduction through raising taxes on the very wealthy who've done very well over the last 10, 20, 30 years. Of course, that's the exact opposite strategy that the Republicans are pushing for here. And I want to make one last point. If anything, the amount of debt we're talking about here is likely to go up, not down, as these negotiations continue. If you look at what people in the Senate, Republican senators are most concerned about, it's Medicaid cuts, It's cuts to the clean energy tax credits. I agree with them on those two policy concerns, but those are two of the things that are actually raising revenue in this bill. I wouldn't be surprised to see that number go north of $4 trillion towards $5 trillion.
I don't know how Scott Bessent's going to rationalize that. That was his number one focus. Let's talk about these new tariffs on aluminum and steel. Because the argument all along hasn't been tariffs are good or tariffs are bad. Tariffs need to be used strategically. In the case of aluminum and steel, we do produce those things here. So is there an argument to be made that they are different from socks and sneakers and T-shirts, which we have no mass market production of? Should we look at these tariffs in a different way, like maybe they do make sense for American jobs, American businesses?
They certainly make a lot more sense than the ones, as you say, on socks and sneakers and toasters. The question is, and going back to the court ruling last week, one thing that court didn't touch is the national security tariffs, where the sense is that the president has pretty wide latitude to decide what's strategically important. And look, I don't know exactly where the line should be, but I think there's the consensus on what is, a strategic asset has moved pretty dramatically over the last couple of years in every country, right? I mean, with Joe Biden, he decided that our capital was a strategic asset and made it harder to spend, to invest abroad. So I don't think it's insane to rethink, like, what should we actually have control over, right? We're realizing now we don't have nearly enough control over semiconductors. Little late, to be starting the supply chain on that. But I think they're more defensible, and they will be like slightly slower, more complicated to work their way through the economy.
Bharat, what's your take on this aluminum and steel? Sure, the EU doesn't like it, but could American businesses like these tariffs? We do produce aluminum and steel here, and it's been hard for us.
I know, I agree. I think that there's you can see both a economic and a national security basis for having more aluminum and steel production domestically. So we're not reliant on those two core products on foreign countries who may not share our values or may experience economic disruptions. We obviously experienced that during the pandemic. We should be clear-eyed, though, that these types of tariffs are going to raise the cost for American manufacturers. The fact that these are going to be more expensive, these are key inputs to a lot of things that other American companies turn around and build. And so when you raise those input costs, it's likely to raise the cost of creating those new outputs, which means that American manufacturing may be ultimately less competitive with companies from Brazil or Japan or the EU because they're not facing those types of tariffs. That's the kind of push and pull you have to deal with when thinking through these tariffs. Again, when we were in the Biden administration, we tried to pair these tariffs with big strategic investments in our industries that would help boost the industry at the same time that you are bringing down imports and making it harder for foreign companies to import into the United States. It's important to have both sides of the scale. It's not clear that the Trump administration is doing that. And in fact, their big, beautiful bill actually undermines American manufacturing and clean energy production in a variety of ways. So they're using one end of the scale, but not the other end.
All right, Bharat. Thank you, Liz. I had more to cover, but sadly.
As Trump pushes aggressive tariffs and adds trillions in debt, markets grow nervous. JP Morgan CEO warns of bond market instability, threatening loans and small businesses. Rising interest rates drive up mortgages, while Trump's tax cuts fuel record deficits. Meanwhile, debates rage over steel tariffs' long-term costs to American manufacturing. Senate GOP scrambles to pass Trump's massive budget as Medicare cuts spark outrage and brutal political backlash.
Oh, baby, the Senate is back in Washington, and it is crunch time for Republicans' budget mega bill. Earlier, Majority Leader John Thune was optimistic that they will be able to get something done and something to the president's desk by the 4th of July. But the Republicans in both chambers are already facing backlash to some of the most, you guessed it, proposed cuts for Medicaid.
We're not cutting Medicaid. What we're doing is strengthening the programs. 4.8 million people will not lose their Medicaid unless they choose to do so.
They are not eligible, so they will be coming off. So people are not, well, we all are going to die.
I made an incorrect assumption that everyone in the auditorium understood that, yes, we are all going to perish from this earth. So I apologize. And I'm really, really glad that I did not have to bring up the subject of the tooth fairy as well.
If you were wondering, yes, Senator Joni Ernst did appear to be filming that mock apology from a cemetery. Joining me now, MSNBC senior political analyst Matthew Dowd. He is also a former George W. Bush strategist and founder of Country Over Party. Help me, Matthew. How is that messaging going to go over with voters? I don't know. Maybe voters aren't going to see it. I saw it, and I'm just baffled, to be honest.
Well, this is it is baffling. So I agree with you. It's very baffling that you would get in front of a town hall and basically say, well, as people raise concerns about people's health care, you say we're all going to die, when every person in that audience knows that. And that's why they were raising the concern, because if they don't have health care, they're more likely to die earlier. I mean, to me, this is everything that goes on when somebody like Joni Ernst, and you know this, when she first got elected, she was supposed to be sort of a moderating Republican influence, where she came from and all of that. But what seemed to have happened is this sort of virus of Donald Trump's cruelty, how you treat people, the coarse things you say, the mean spirit with which you act, what policies you push, especially this one, we can talk about this in a sec, what policies you can push that are cruel to certain groups. And Joni Ernst is just another person that has basically turned to that sort of Donald Trump tact of how cruel can I be?
Well, then let's talk about the bill and the strategy around it, because there's all sorts of huddles happening. And on Wednesday, Majority Leader John Thune and House Speaker Mike Johnson are going to be holding the Big Six meeting. What should we expect?
Well, my guess is what John Thune already understands, and I think previously we had a guest that talked about basically what's likely to happen is that all of the cuts, or not all of, many of the cuts to Medicaid and Medicare that are in the House bill will likely have to come out in the Senate because of where people fall on that, especially the 3 or 4 Republicans that don't agree with that in the course of this. I was fascinated by Speaker Johnson's statement that says we're not taking anybody off Medicare or Medicaid. We're basically, it's if people aren't eligible, they have a choice. Once they're no longer eligible, they're not being taken up because they have a choice to be whether or not they're eligible. I mean, it's such a roundabout weird. It's like the Jim Crow law. It would do the Jim Crow laws in the states, which is we didn't stop people from registering to vote. We just had a whole series of requirements that people had that they couldn't meet. So they could stand up and say, we never stopped an African-American person from voting. The same thing here. We didn't stop a poor person from being on Medicaid. And then, oh, by the way, here's 11 things they have to do that many of them they can't meet.
Okay, then Missouri Senator Josh Hawley has been one who's been vocal about opposing the Medicaid cuts. But earlier today, he posted, quote, just had a great talk with President Trump about the big, beautiful bill. He said again, no Medicaid benefit cuts. Here's what I do not get. If Americans are going to lose their Medicaid or their eligibility to Medicaid, given the new requirements, won't this hurt Republicans? So why lie about it? Why not just say, here's what we're doing and let it happen and run for re-election next time around? Why be dishonest about what we know is going to happen if this bill goes through?
Well, they're dishonest about it. I mean, it sort of answers their own question. They're dishonest about it because they know if they were honest about it, it'd be unpopular to be honest about it. So they basically say, oh, we have fiscal responsibility and we're doing all these cuts. But, oh, by the way, we're not cutting anything that's going to matter to you, which doesn't make any sense in the course of this.
But in the end, aren't the voters going to know, right? If it's a year and a half from now and suddenly people lose their coverage, aren't they going to say, here's my senator, here's my congressman, and who's in the White House?
The reality will always tell the voters what to do. So this is my view on what the perception of the economy versus and as well as and tariffs and all the things that go along with it, as well as budget cuts. No matter what the message is from President Trump or the Republicans, if in the fall of 2026, people have lost coverage, their inflation is still high, their products cost more, and the jobs are harder to come by, it doesn't matter what the messaging is from the Republicans. Reality is what tells people what's going on in their lives.
Is this a moment that Democrats can or should capitalize on, or do you think let Republicans do their thing, let it play out, and let the American people watch, because we're already seeing Joni Ernst now facing a challenger.
I think Democrats need to come up with an economic populist message that doesn't just talk about cuts and how they're going to hurt people. They need to take cuts and link it with tax breaks for billionaires, and it's a system set up that only enhances the amount of money that billionaires and multimillionaires have. And so Democrats should talk about the cuts, but I think they need to it needs to be a Huey Long message. I mean, not to go back in a long reference from nearly 100 years ago, but it basically, Democrats need to adopt their sort of economic populism that says the money is being taken from you and given to the billionaires.
Wow, I thought you were about to say Huey Lewis, but I don't think Hip to Be Square is a smart campaign song. But alas, it was Huey Long. Matthew, always good to see you.
Republicans face mounting criticism over proposed Medicare cuts in Trump's $4 trillion budget plan. While leaders insist programs are strengthened, critics call it deceptive. GOP senators struggle to defend harsh requirements likely to strip millions of health care. Democrats urge populist messaging, linking these cuts to tax breaks for billionaires. AI threatens to wipe out millions of jobs, but Washington stays silent while tech giants quietly reshape the job market.
Tonight, we are putting the spotlight on artificial intelligence and how it could impact or is impacting the job market. The CEO of the AI company Anthropic has told Axios, quote, AI could wipe out half of all entry-level white-collar jobs and spike unemployment to 10 or 20% in the next 1 to 5 years, and it is already underway. There's new reporting that Meta aims to start using AI to generate ad content and conduct safety and privacy reviews. And that's just one company. Here to discuss, Gary Rivlin, Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter and author of AI Valley, Microsoft, Google, and the trillion-dollar race to cash in on artificial intelligence. Gary, I am so glad you're here. Do you see the mass elimination of jobs, especially entry-level, white-collar, I'm talking, recent college grad jobs?
The CEO's point was that we as a country, policymakers, are not taking this seriously. There are very few in Washington who are taking this seriously, and there are even fewer doing something about it. I think he's overstating that. I don't think we're going to have half the entry-level white-collar jobs wiped out within 5 years. But AI is coming, and it's going to have a serious negative impact on the job market.
What kinds of skills do we what kind of jobs do we believe are going to get wiped out from AI?
See, what's so scary about AI is it's trying to emulate reasoning, which is to say anyone has a job where they're thinking, they're creative, or they're making decision-making. That's the goal. It's not there yet. It's going after entry-level jobs because it's really only at an entry-level skill set and all. But, I have a hard time naming many jobs that would be impervious to AI. I joke with my kids, become a plumber, become an electrician. I really don't see it taking that place soon.
Those aren't a joke. We need people to fill those jobs. Recent college grads are already struggling to find work. You just mentioned what the CEO of Anthropic is concerned about. Do you see any corners of Washington preparing for this, preparing the fact that young people may be facing a far more bleak job market?
2 years ago, Washington was talking about artificial intelligence, but no longer. Obviously there's a lot of other things that they're talking about, but that's my big concern, that we have time to deal with this. But instead, I feel we're going to fritter away the time, and only when it's starting to have a much larger impact are policymakers going to wake up to what is starting to happen and what's going to continue to happen.
But are we overestimating what our policymakers are actually going to do? Look how they've regulated social media companies, nil. Look what they're doing in the crypto industry, nothing. So do we fully understand this technology as we're rushing to implement it? Who are the regulators and what would they be regulating? They still call it the Facebook. Well, not to be sassy, but yeah.
2 years ago, I would have said I think Washington's learned the lesson of social media, but I was over optimistic on that. I fear you're right. These 4 years, there's going to be virtually no regulation on AI, crypto, a broad range of things, but on technology, there really isn't a regulator looking into this.
The administration is already cracking down on international student visas. In 2022, non-citizens accounted for over half of doctoral degrees, for people who got their doctoral degrees in fields associated with AI. Many of those people graduate, they get their doctorates here, they work for companies in America, they start companies in America. Do you believe the administration's move with international students could end up hurting us in the AI field?
This is so short-sighted. I don't understand all these folks in Silicon Valley, these leaders in Silicon Valley who've embraced Trump when he's cutting off foundational research. I feel like that's our secret sauce in this country, that we put money into research and some of it ends up in the hands of entrepreneurs who create companies around that. We're cutting that off. We're cutting off, founders. I saw a stat that over half the company, I think it's 70% of the startups have at least one founder who was born overseas. And if we're locking them out, I think make China great again, I guess.
So is there anyone from that tech universe pushing back on the administration specifically about this industry and the great minds that come out of our universities and make them greater?
I'm not hearing very much coming from Silicon Valley pushing back on that. And clearly the people who are in the Trump camp are not pushing back on that. At least they're not doing it publicly.
AI may eliminate up to half of entry-level white-collar jobs within 5 years, warns Anthropic's CEO. Meta and others are already deploying AI to replace workers. Policymakers show little urgency, while immigration restrictions risk starving America's AI talent pipeline. Experts fear US inaction could fuel China's global tech advantage. As Trump battles trade partners, racks up debt, slashes healthcare, and triggers AI disruption, America faces compounding economic and political storms. With rising global tensions and vulnerable job markets, the stakes couldn't be higher. And Washington's inaction may leave the nation dangerously unprepared for what's coming next.